fill in the blank. You're not getting any younger.
So learn what it means to fully love yourself.
Hey, you. Yes, you. Welcome to the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast, a podcast for people who want to disrupt their lives for a good reason, to make it count. I'm your host, Jen Glantz, and every week I'll drop a new episode with stories from real people just like you, who woke up one morning and decided to make big changes, starting with small things. We'll cover topics like entrepreneurship, love, failure, and self-care. Hey, you're not getting any younger, so let's make this an adventure. Ready? Hey, any youngers, it's me, your host, Jen Glantz. Welcome back to another episode of the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast. Here we are, another week, and this week's topic is all about the art of having conversations with yourself. If you listened to last week, you heard me talk about how you gotta have conversations with other people, and those are important. But this week, I wanna talk about the art of being able to release emotion, release feelings, and release what the heck is in your head. And sometimes to do that, those conversations you have with yourself, maybe those are you doing it out loud, maybe those are you writing it down. And to help fuel this conversation today, I have an amazing guest on the show. Her name is Jess Song, and she is the founder of Back to Self, which is a really cool online website where she offers different events, different coaching, different community type of programs where you can get back to yourself through journaling. She calls it emotional navigation through journaling. And Jess is a really big badass herself. She's spent over 12 years creating sustainable emotional development programs for underserved, immigrant, diaspora, and trauma-surviving populations. She's passionate about mental health aspect for underserved communities, which I find to be absolutely incredible. And today we talk about not only how do we journal. I know that sounds like an obvious thing. You write in a journal, but it's more than that. How do you make it something that you look forward to doing? How do you make it something that you commit to doing quite often? And how do you open up through the power of words, which at first can feel a little funky, can make you feel like you're back in elementary school writing in a diary. But journaling is so much more than that, and we often stop doing that once we leave elementary school or middle school. I always go back and read through my journals from the past when I was much younger, and I remember one of my journals was around the time when Clueless was popular, so everything in the journal was as if and like and all of those funky words, and the things I was writing about back then, while now they seem so trivial, back then it meant everything to me. And that's sort of the power of journaling, is often returning to your past and seeing how much you've changed and shaped and grown, and maybe not even grown so much, but that you've been able to get over and get through really tough things in your life. So Jess is going to talk about her process today on the show. I also want to bring up another way of journaling that I've used in the past. I'm the kind of person who, when I have tried to journal, I forget to do it and then I give up. But one of the things that a friend of mine suggested I do, because I'm on my computer every day, is take a simple Excel spreadsheet, and on one column of the spreadsheet, write down all the dates every day. So May 1st, May 2nd, May 3rd, all of the dates. And then in the other column, every day, write down a sentence about the day. A sentence, a paragraph, a story, whatever you want, maybe even a word, because then when you look back at those dates, it'll start to trigger memories. And when I've gone through some of the hardest times of my life over the past couple of years, I've resulted to doing that over journaling, because when you're going through something really tough, you might not have the brain power or the energy or even the desire to get it all out on paper, but you might be able to just write down a word or a sentence. And then when you look back on it years later, months later, even weeks later, you start to remember everything. And it is beautiful to see how far you have come from that moment, or how that moment is still happening in your life, but how you've become more comfortable with it because now you're getting it out of your head. I think you're going to learn a lot from this episode. I'm super excited to have Jess on the show. She's awesome, and I think you'll really love and relate to a lot of what she has to say. And definitely check out her website, Back to Self, because right now in the time we live in, I think everyone can get back to themselves. Her website is backtoself.us, and on social, she is at Jess Song. What a cool name. All right, let's dive into this week's episode. And as always, if you are a fan of the show, first of all, thank you. I appreciate you. I think about you quite often. I just feel so grateful to have listeners who come to the show, appreciate the show, and share the show. So if you're listening to the show, remember, leave us a review, rate the show. That always helps us get more guests on the show every week. And as always, come hang out with us in the Secret You're Not Getting Any Younger Facebook group. I know Facebook could be a really heated place these days. Lots of opinions, lots of fights, lots of arguments. That's not what our group is for. You'll feel loved and welcomed. We are a group that supports every type of person. So come join the group and have your community, have your crew of people who have your back. All my love, Jen Glantz. Today's episode is brought to you by Jen and Juice Coaching by yours truly. For the past 5 years, I've worked with over 100 people to help them feel, well, less stuck. Whether you're looking to change careers, start a side hustle, or just get a strategy for your life, head on over to jenglantz.com/coaching and you can find out about my 1-hour coaching specials that will help you feel like you can finally cross those things off your to-do list and start whatever kind of project, life change, or dream that you have.
Yeah, my very first question for you is, how would you describe who you are and what you do to a person you just met at a party?
I love this question. So I will start with what I do to a person I just met at a party. When I come to parties, I also tend to be the person that doesn't immediately walk up to strangers. I kind of linger back a little bit. And I also look for people who are not talking to other people. And I tend to kind of like try to find a way to be near them and start a casual conversation. Personally, I don't like small talk. So I tend to steer conversations into deep places very quickly. I ask them about their like values and life goals and are they happy, and conversations get real deep real quick with me.
I love that. And I can only hope that one day I meet you at a party, because I am the same. I sort of linger in the back. I look for the person who no one else is talking to. Just to ask you, do you have like a go-to conversation starter that you'll bring up?
I mean, it's usually the same, like, what do you do? Like, and usually when people talk to me about their careers, I just kind of get a sense of, whether they're happy with their situations and what they actually want to do. And I tend to ask a lot of questions around what people want. Like at the core, what do they actually want? And that conversation always takes us to really, really fun places.
Ooh, that's a good one. I think I need to add that to my list of things to ask people, because usually people just end it with, oh, what do you do? Oh, you do this? Great. Bye. Like
Yeah.
there's no
And I think what's
follow-up.
interesting is that people usually always start with telling me what they don't want when I ask them what they want.
Yep.
Because they're kind of not always in the default mindset of thinking about what they want. So when I find that, if I ask them what they want and they respond with, well, I don't want to be in this environment anymore, and I know that I'm not happy here, I'll kind of ask them again, like, okay, but like, what do you want? And a lot of the times people are just like, well, and then they just like forget I'm there and just kind of go inwards. And I'm like, yes. So I'd say that's what I do to strangers I meet at parties. I make them introspect about their desires.
I love it. It's like hanging out with you at a party is part therapy and part just having that real conversation that skips so where do you live? And that, like the small talk that really doesn't build relationships. So
Yeah.
I love that. And then how would you answer the question of what you do if they turn the table on you?
Sure. So I am the founder of Back to Self, which is which focuses on emotional navigation through journaling. And I tend to focus a lot on emotional navigation with like a multicultural lens. That's my pitch. That's my spiel.
And usually, what do people usually ask back when you say that to them? What's the most common thing people will say when you introduce yourself with that?
I think a lot of the times people immediately respond with, oh my God, I've been wanting to journal for so long, or they'll kind of like, or how do you journal? Or I love journaling. That's really great. So everybody has a different relationship with journaling. And I feel like lately people are thinking a lot about it. But they either feel like they're not the right person for journaling, or, you know, they're already bought in and it's like a lifestyle. So journaling seems to be a trigger for a lot of people.
Yeah, and it's something that I've always been so interested in. I look back at my last couple of years and it's something I've tried here and there and then I gave up on. And
Oh,
the other
yes.
night, ironically, I was on a Zoom call with friends and two of the women were talking about how they journal, and I just thought, I'm so jealous. So I want to hear a little bit about your process and your background. How did you get started journaling and how did you keep up with it?
Sure. So I used to journal a lot when I was younger, but I mostly kept an online blog. So before Facebook and MySpace was a thing, these online journals was kind of like the way to social media back in the day. And I found myself when I was like 14 or 15, just kind of processing my own challenges through online journaling. And if it wasn't about myself, and I would like ponder about the world, I would be like, you know, why do people cheat? And I would have this like philosophical debate with myself, like on, you know, Zanga or like LiveJournal, about, you know, society and human behavior. And at a certain point, once I went into college, I just kind of dropped out. I dropped out of the blogging scene. It just didn't feel helpful anymore. And then I didn't journal for maybe like 10 years after that. And I was going through a time that was really transitional for me, and I was trying to process a lot of things. But I don't know if this is how it works for you, but sometimes when I get in my own head, there's no ceiling and there's no floor. So it's just I have all these thoughts that don't go anywhere. And I tried to get back into journaling. I had all of these notebooks that I never wrote in. You know, I'm like a compulsive notebook buyer, but I'd never be able to finish it. And what ended up happening was, so prior to starting, back to self, I was a nonprofit for like 15 years. And 12 of those years were working with underserved communities. So like, low income, immigrant, LGBTQ trauma survivors and things like that. And a lot of my work involved incorporating like emotional health and emotional development, kind of from a counseling framework into non-counseling environments. And I would end up giving a lot of trainings on healthy communication, or trainings on, how to get through barriers to, emotional, to reach like an emotional goal, how to have healthy relationships with other people. So I'd be giving these trainings to adult volunteers and to the youth that I worked with. And at one point I was like, what if I applied these frameworks to myself when I'm trying to journal? And that broke just a lot of barriers I didn't realize I was holding on to. So I was developing I had a pretty good practice, and it was, hold on, let me, sorry. So I had developed a pretty stable practice for myself, and especially during a really transitional time for me. And I credit journaling to just kind of speeding the healing process and transitional journey for me.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about that is the power of sitting down and writing out what's going on in your thoughts. So talk about what was the power behind journaling? What changed? What did you feel were the results of starting this practice and doing it?
Yeah, sure. I think there are a few things. I think, what I tell a lot of people that journaling has done for me is that, one, I was able to develop a stronger, more kind of compassionate relationship with my emotions. I'm able to honor them. I can validate them. And I think the most important part was I was able to validate them without other people's opinions or energy, like impacting what they are. Right. So, I'm not relying on friends so much to help me process my thoughts. I'm able to get into a habit of holding space for myself and asking myself what I need, and really bringing it back to myself, which is why I ended up naming, this back to self. Because I think in the end, we all benefit from coming back to what we want and what we desire and what our core values are. And we forget that so much throughout this time. And I think what was really interesting for me was that it also kind of helped me practice my emotional language, my emotional vocabulary. Like if I have a vague feeling at the beginning of the day, I might not realize that I'm like slightly triggered by something or, fearful of something. It's just a vague feeling I'm carrying all day. But if I give myself the intentional time to sit and write through it, I'm better able to pinpoint or have like a sense of what it is. I can name it a little bit better. I can figure out the environment that I first started feeling it. And since I'm able to anchor that in myself, I can also communicate to other people. Like, hey, I just want to let you know when you said this, it made me feel this. And I'm not really sure if that's the kind of like energy we want in our, exchange. So journaling helped me develop a much more confident emotional vocabulary. Yeah.
It's so fascinating because I'm just picturing in my head what this process looks like for you. So how does it go? Do you wake up in the morning? Do you journal? How long do you do it? Like, describe what your personal process is.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started, I think for me, there was something inside of me that was very insistent that I process my thoughts through writing. Writing has always been my default. My default. So instead of talking to other people, my heart kept telling me to write. But the thing is that starting a habit is just as difficult as breaking a habit. Like, yeah, I don't know if you've tried to ever like start flossing or quit smoking. It's really, really difficult, and you have to commit to it every day. So when I first started, I did what they call morning pages or artist pages. But essentially what it is you just commit to filling 3 pages a day. So, front, back, front. And, the thing is that I've always working in nonprofit, I was working 10-hour days. At some points I'm volunteering. So I don't always have the time. So what I committed to doing was completing 3 pages a day, even if they're not all in one sitting. And what was really helpful for me with that is that, how sometimes when you're sitting in front of somebody and they're not saying anything, so you just kind of keep babbling to fill that silence?
Yes.
I found myself doing that with the pages. I found myself kind of, okay, I'm stressed. And I wouldn't know what else to say beyond that. But because I had committed to 3 pages a day, I would just keep gently writing through. And then sometimes I would have so much to write and just so much is pouring out of me, but I would also commit to stopping at 3 pages a day. And what that helped me do is I would kind of clear the surface a little bit, and I would be able to think about it. Like now that I was juicy, I'm at a place now where I can either think about it, I can like meditate on it, or keep thinking about it on the train ride to work. So it really was just like a nice check-in conversation with myself. And it was more like if I was my own partner, it was like I was doing a very intentional check-in with myself as a partner. And it deepened my relationship with myself in a way I didn't expect.
I love that. I'm just picturing that right now, of that check in with yourself. I mean, when do we do that otherwise? I'm trying to think, other than the occasional moment where we find ourselves angry and stressed, rarely do we sit ourselves down and say, why do we feel like this? And something like this, making this a habit, is a great way to check in. Even if you don't have much to say, did you find on days where you didn't have much to say, random things flowed out and you had a big revelation, or you saw things differently than you thought you would when you woke up that morning?
Yeah, 100%. And you mentioned that a lot of the times we only really check in with ourselves when we're in like a highly emotional state. And I kind of compare that to, if you have a friend who only calls you when they're mad, or they only call you when they need to vent. It's a weird friendship, right? It's a very like one-sided friendship. And yeah, there are definitely days where I didn't have a strong emotion. I didn't have anything. And a lot of the times people journal with the purpose of finding solutions to things, and they feel that if they're not finding a solution or resolving some emotion, then journaling wasn't successful. But that really wasn't the case. A lot of the times, so one of my basic frameworks, I talk about this more in depth in my workshops, but I remember when I went to college, my first major was a writing major. And there, one of the things that I heard, the advice that they give to writers all the time is like, listen, you have to show up to work. You have to write every day, whether or not you have something to write. But the thing is that if you sit down at your notebook expecting to complete a story every time, you're not going to write. So what they encourage folks to do, what they encourage writers to do, is to just simply record the details. Just simply record the things that are around them. Try not to focus on like completing a full story arc, but just, I'm sitting at a cafe, the chair under me is cold, the coffee is, it's just describe things. And I found that doing that, I was able to fill 3 pages without even realizing it. And, one of the tips that I talk about in the workshops is also doing that with yourself, right? You scan yourself, I am feeling tension in my neck. I am feeling like I want to eat even though I'm not hungry. So just kind of like really scanning myself objectively allowed me to almost like cheat those 3 pages. But then because I'm like warming up I'm doing small talk with myself. I'm able to warm up to a place where I'm like, this interesting feeling did occur the other day that I don't think I was ready to talk about then, but maybe I'll just note it now.
I love that. And I'm wondering, people who are listening and myself, I have a million thoughts going through my head about how I want to start this. What are maybe 2 tips you have for a person who has never journaled before, who has always been tempted and flirted with this idea, but has never started? What would you tell them to do?
Sure. I think the first thing I actually tell folks who want to journal but aren't really sure how, before you learn to write, learn to sit. I think for me, journaling has become a part of my meditative process. But the thing is so much of meditation is just practicing getting to a place where you're sitting with yourself through the discomfort, like through blankness, through, goals or tons of thoughts. Like there's always some kind of action that we want to take away from what we're doing, or there's always some problem that we want to solve. But for me, even before I came back to journaling, I had to practice learning to just reconnect with myself and sit with myself. And even now, because it is a practice, sometimes when I want to journal, but, maybe I'm feeling something that's too uncomfortable or something that's too vague, it's so much easier to look away from that or to do something else than it is to like approach it. So I have to give myself time to sit and settle into myself before I can write. So that's my first bullet, which is before you learn to write, learn to sit, and kind of embed those processes together. And I think the second piece of advice that I would give in terms of starting to journal is to create a routine or a ritual around it. I think, of course, anytime you want to build a habit, you want to create some kind of routine or ritual. But for me, I found that, when I'm journaling at home, regardless of how much time I have, what I used to do when I, lived in an apartment that had like really good ventilation is I would light incense. And the specific reason why I chose incense is because it had like a finite amount of time, right? When the incense is lit, I start. Like time has begun. And when the incense is finished, I wrap up. And that's kind of how I measure time for myself. But right now, since I'm not in an environment where lighting incense is like considerate, for me, it's like I get a glass of water, I turn on a specific playlist, and I, clear my desk so that my writing space is at the very least like clean, and then I start. So it's just even like a small routine or ritual around the beginning of it, so that you can tell your brain that it's time. Those are the 2 main things that I would recommend for folks who just want to build a habit.
All of this just sounds like something that you treat yourself with. Like this is just an example of something to do that's simple, that's free, and that becomes a habit where you treat yourself nicely.
Yes.
And for a lot of us, we don't do that, or we associate treating ourselves nicely with buying something expensive or getting our hair done or facial done. But this is just something that anyone can do anywhere. And a lot of what you do with Back to Self is you do these workshops and you work with a lot of people in underserved communities. So how do you find that the power of journaling helps people who are maybe going through a tough time, or just maybe finding that they really need something to help them through day-to-day struggles?
Absolutely. One of the main reasons why I want to, let me kind of rephrase that. I think for me, the reason why journaling is such a powerful tool for emotional navigation is because it's so accessible and because it's virtually free. Unless you have a unhealthy notebook habit like I do, but it's essentially free, right? And for me, the biggest thing is that everyone can benefit from therapy, but not everyone has access to therapy. Even at sliding scale, if you're seeing someone weekly and the lowest that they'll take is $60 a session, that's almost $300. I don't know if that's actually accurate math, but that's almost $300 in a month that people may not be able to afford no matter how much they want it. So I always say that journaling is not a replacement for therapy, and my workshops, they feel very therapeutic, but it's not a replacement for therapy. But my background, I've always worked in counseling adjacent realms, and my college education was along psychology and human behavior. And ultimately what it is that I want to make emotional navigation frameworks accessible to people whether or not they have access to therapy. Most of the times you learn those frameworks in therapy, or if you have a really good friend. But we don't have access to that on our own. So that's one of the reasons why, I, especially being in nonprofit for so many years, I'm hardwired to be like, how can I make this accessible for everybody who needs it, the most in need? People who can afford therapy, great. But there's so many more people who cannot. And there's so many more people who maybe they're not even in the demographic for therapy. Maybe you're just going through a weird transitional time, and you just want like 3 bullets that you can kind of do or think about. A lot of my workshops are about reframing our experiences. So that's really where I align my mission, or that's where my mission was born, is that, look, these frameworks exist. They're really life-changing. And I don't want you to have to rely on me in order to keep that up. You can take this home and you can do this homework and you can develop your relationship with yourself. You just have to keep committing to coming back to yourself. And to me, with journaling, it's just, to me, the reason why it's considered self-care for me is because sometimes I'm not going to have that friend that's going to call me and be like, hey, hey, Jess, hey, girl, how are you? I just want to check in on you and see how you're feeling today. Chances are we're all going through something, or that friend is busy, or maybe you don't have like that kind of friend in your world right now. But that shouldn't deprive me of getting that check-in in my own world. I can give that to myself as an act of love.
Yeah.
And the other part about just, working for underserved communities, I think for me, the reason why I love bringing it back. The other part of Back to Self is having these community conversations around emotional navigation in, communities of color. I think, me being born in New York, I'm a daughter of immigrants. It's a very interesting world that I'm navigating here, where the way that my parents express their emotions and the way that my parents show love to me might look so different than the very Western American ideal of what's healthy. And so much of wellness is based on a very, Western Eurocentric perspective, right? Like, hey, listen, if your parents, put their needs first, or if your parents didn't support your emotional development, then, you were in a toxic environment. And I'm just like, no, maybe you just had immigrant parents. That's not fair. And a lot of psychology's founding fathers were all Western European men. So where do we fit in that dialogue? How do we fill that gray area with compassion? How do we fill that gray area with understanding? How do I learn to have emotional language if I wasn't taught emotional language, without carrying resentment around the fact that I wasn't taught emotional language? So these are the other ways that I try to empower underserved communities around emotional navigation. It's just like, you can't deny that your identities and all these intersecting realities play a role in how capable you are of navigating your own emotions and communicating them to other people.
Wow, that was incredibly powerful, and I'm grateful for your explanation of that. And I think a lot of people listening will appreciate hearing that, because for some, they just have been taught that, one way of life is the way of life, and anything else, like you said, is toxic or wrong. So definitely appreciate your explanation. And I want to end this interview like we end them all. Just fill in the blank. You're not getting any younger. So
learn what it means to fully love yourself.
I love that. That was incredible. Your tips are amazing. Please share with our listeners where they can find out more about you and Back to Self.
Sure. They can find me on Instagram at Jess Song. That's JESSSONG, 3 S's. And they can find my website at backtoself.us.
Thank you so much.
Hey, you. Thank you for listening to the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast. There are hundreds of thousands of pods out there, so thank you for listening to this one. You can find the show notes for this week's episode up on our website, anyyounger.com. Subscribe, rate, and review the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast on iTunes so that other ears around the world can listen too. Oh, and join our secret You're Not Getting Any Younger Facebook group, where over 1,000 people are talking about how to disrupt their lives, for a good reason, to make it count. Until next week, all my love, Jen Glantz.